Hello everyone, my name is Parsai. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. I teach immigration consulting at Ashton College. I'm also the author of 88 Tips on Immigration to Canada, which is a book available on Amazon websites. Today I would like to talk about a relatively sensitive matter, which is filing for refugee in Canada. Of course, if you refer to the news or politicians, there are so many discussions around this topic, refugees, and there are many negativity out there. But when you refer to this from an immigration law point of view, filing for refugee is another option for immigration to Canada. Obviously, you need to meet the necessary requirements. What I am going to do in this session, which is session number 10 of my educational and training videos about immigration and visa to Canada, is to stay away from everything political or newsworthy and just focus on legal matters and procedural matters related to filing for refugee in terms of immigration to Canada. If you look at Section 12 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, it divides becoming a permanent resident of Canada into three major groups. And I have said this before in my previous videos as well. Group number one is family reunification. It means you immigrate to Canada because of your family members, like sponsoring spouses and children or parents. The other option would be economic class, and economic immigrants are those people who immigrate to Canada because of their financial status, because of their skills, because of work experience, because of their education, and so on. But the third group is called refugees, and refugees could also immigrate to Canada. But who is a refugee? If you look at Section 96 and 97 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, you realize that, in fact, IRPA has clear definition of a refugee. A refugee under Section 96 could be a convention refugee. These refugees are people who are normally displaced from their home country, and they have gone to a third country, and in that country they usually approach the United Nations headquarters or UNHCR offices, and they request for a refugee status. Of course, their request could be based on their gender, based on their sexual orientation, based on their religion, so the different kinds of hardship and discrimination and threats that they face because of those reasons. If this is the case, then UNHCR employees will review their application, they look at the documents, they interview them, and if they are convinced, they register them as convention refugees. So that's one group. Of course, inside Canada or at also immigration authorities could also identify a person as a convention refugee. The second group are those people who are defined under Section 97 of the Act. These people, they are not necessarily convention refugees, but they are people who need protection by Canada. If Canada realizes that their request for protection is valid, then they will offer them refugee status in Canada. So it could be either convention refugees or people who need protection. But where can you apply for refugee? You may apply for refugee outside Canada, at a port of entry, or inside Canada. For outside Canada applications, as I mentioned before, it usually starts off with referring to UNHCR or another entity related to United Nations and filing for refugees. If that person is approved, then that person may be resettled to Canada. The resettlement process is, of course, they follow certain criteria, but in Canada, it could fall under three major programs. So one of the programs is Government Assisted Refugees Program, or GAR. This is an initiative by the government of Canada. So every year they look into those claims and they pick a few of those people and they resettle them to Canada. They might have some criteria in mind, and it depends on the current government of Canada, the caps they have considered for refugees, and the budgets that they have for resettlement. But if they look at that and they are convinced that this person is a good nominee, they will resettle them to Canada. The second group are private sponsorship of refugee programs, or PSR. And the third group are blended visa office referred programs. So in other words, sometimes just citizens of Canada, they help a person to move to Canada or resettle to Canada. And sometimes it's a combination of, for example, charities in Canada and the government of Canada that they help a person to come to Canada. I can give you an example. For example, the group of 5. So 5 Canadian families, they accept a refugee. They say, we will pay for their resettlement cost and for their stay in Canada for the first year of staying in Canada. We will help them with a roof on their head, food in their belly, and their personal expenses. Under any of those programs, a person could be resettled to Canada. Obviously, the immigration officers need to make sure that the person who is being resettled to Canada is not a threat to our country. So in other words, that person is not a criminal, that person has not been involved in organized crime, that person is not a security or safety threat to our country. And that's why they run background checks, they do interviews, they look into the documents of that person. And it's a time-consuming and energy-consuming process. That's why many people who are in the waiting list for resettlement, they have to wait months or sometimes years before actually being resettled to Canada. But as soon as they reach the border of Canada and they land in Canada, they become permanent residents of Canada. So upon arrival, they are permanent residents of Canada. If they stay in Canada, after 3 years or so, they may apply for citizenship and become part of our country as a Canadian. So that's for resettlement. So what about applying at a port of entry or applying inside Canada? Generally speaking, a person could reach Canada either by applying for a visit visa, study permit, work permit, ETA, something like that. So they are able to travel to Canada legally, and then when they reach the port of entry or when they enter Canada, they may file for refugee status. Sometimes people obtain fraudulent documents, a fraudulent passport or fraudulent visa, and somehow they manage come to Canada, and at the port of entry they file for refugee status. For the second group, applying inside Canada is almost not an option, because usually a border services officer will realize that the documents are fraudulent and they prevent them from entering Canada unless they file for refugee. Regardless, if the application is at the port of entry or inside Canada, there are many similarities. The only major difference is that at the port of entry, you don't need to fill out the basis of claim form immediately. You will meet with an immigration officer, they will interview you, and then they will pass you some documents, including the form that is called basis of claim, or BOC, and then they give you some time to fill out the forms, a few days, and to submit them to an inland office. But if you are inside Canada and you want to file for refugee status, then what you need to do is to fill out all the forms up front, and they are available on IRCC website, including the basis of claim, why you are making that claim, and then put them together and take them to an inland office. Okay, regardless, you end up in one of those inland offices. So when you reach an inland office, I give you an example. For example, in Toronto, you need to go to the office in Etobicoke right now if it doesn't change in the future. So when you reach that office, you present, you say that I'm here to claim refugee status. They will provide you with a piece of paper. You fill out your personal information on that paper. And then they also give you a Ziploc. So you put everything in the Ziploc, you give it back to them. They give you a number, and then they usually call you after a couple of hours, give or take, sometimes more, sometimes less, depends how busy they are. And you will go to a kiosk. An immigration officer is on the other side. They will quickly review with you the content of your forms and claims. If they have any questions, or they think there need to be some corrections need to be made, they make those corrections, and then they ask you to sit or come back after a few days. And then when you come back after the few days, or when you sit, another officer will call you and they interview. The purpose of that interview is to see whether you are eligible to file for refugee or not. Most people, they are eligible to file for refugee, but an example that you are not is that you previously filed for refugee and abandoned that application, or your application was refused. So you cannot reapply for refugee over and over again. It's a one-time thing. If they realize that you are eligible, you usually receive a form called IFHP, or Interim Federal Health Program form, which also kind of your ID at that moment, because they collect your passports and travel documents from you. With that form, if you need health services, you can receive free health services for most of the health services. These health services are covered by federal government of Canada. They are not necessarily the same as the health services that provinces of Canada offer to permanent residents or citizens, but there are many similarities. Sometimes they are better, sometimes they are worse. You also, when you apply for refugee, you also could apply for study permit or a work permit, depending on whether you want to study in Canada or you want to work in Canada. And usually you receive your work permit within anywhere between 3 weeks to 6 weeks from the day that you submit the work permit. Sometimes it could take a lot longer or less. For a study permit, you definitely need to have an admission from school, then you may apply for a study permit. And then, of course, when you receive your work permit, now the work permit is an open work permit. It means it allows you to work for any employer in Canada. And it's kind of a relief. So now you have the health coverage and you also have the work permit, so you may work and wait for your hearing. But what happens now? So the day that the officer interviews you, they will prepare a package and send it to a court system called IRB, Immigration Refugee Board of Canada, which is an administrative tribunal, and it's all over Canada. So they send the package back to IRB. A case manager at IRB will review all your documents and make a decision. The decision is whether this is a simplified kind of application or it's not a simplified application. If it's a simplified, they normally inform you and immigration authorities that it is not really necessary to go through a hearing. They can make a decision quickly. They give you a few days to submit any other documents that you have, and if those documents are satisfactory, then IRB will approve you and you don't really need to go through a hearing process. This doesn't happen very often, and it also highly depends on the nationality of the person and where they are coming from. But the second group are people who need to go through a real hearing. The hearing will happen at a division of IRB called RPD, or Refugee Protection Division. The Refugee Protection Division sets a hearing date for you, and there's a wait time for that. Nowadays, for example, in Toronto, the wait time is roughly around 18 months. So you need to wait, and they will call you for a hearing. And then, of course, before the hearing date, if you have more documents, you can send them to RPD. And in the hearing date, of course, you will be there. The judge, which we call them member, the member will be there, and also your counsel, which could be somebody like me, will be there, and of course the counsel for the minister or the lawyer for the immigration authorities will be there. And then the judge receives information from you, and based on that and based on the documents that you already submitted, they decide whether to grant you refugee status or not, or to accept your claim or not. If they accept your claim and there is no objection by the minister's counsel, then you may apply for permanent residency. What if the minister's counsel has an objection? Then they can appeal the decision of RPD. What if RPD actually refuses your application. In that case, your counsel or you can appeal that decision. The appeal goes to another division of IRB, and that division is called RAD, or Refugee Appeal Division. Usually the RAD doesn't hold actual hearings. There are no oral hearings. What they do is that they receive documents from the previous hearing. They also receive arguments by your counsel and the arguments by the minister counsel, and then they will review it and decide whether to grant you refugee status or not. If they say yes, then what will happen is that you can apply for permanent residency. So you fill out a few forms and you submit the application for permanent residency. The chances that they accept that permanent residency application are very high, unless something extraordinary happens. They realize that you are immensely inadmissible to Canada, something like that. But if they don't find anything fishy is going on, they will accept your permanent residency application and you become a permanent resident of Canada. And then after usually a couple of years or more, you may be eligible for applying for citizenship of Canada. While you are waiting for your citizenship, because you don't have permanent residency of Canada, you may also apply for something called a travel document, which looks like a Canadian passport, but the nationality will be your original nationality, not Canadian. With that travel document, you could travel anywhere in this world but the country that you are coming from, because the whole idea is that you are not safe in that country. Okay? So what if the application is not approved? Then what should you do? And usually I give this metaphor that filing for refugee inside Canada is like a funnel. So entering it is so easy, but then getting the positive response, you need to go through many hurdles. And unfortunately, if the answer is no, it means that RPD refuses you, RAD refuses you, then what happens is dark. First of all, when you apply for refugee or you file for asylum in Canada, they will issue something called a removal order or a departure order, to be more specific. That departure order means that you have to leave Canada, but the departure order stays. It means that it's not activated. They won't activate it until the time that you receive a refusal from RPD or RAD. As soon as you receive the refusals, now the departure order is enforceable and they can remove you from Canada. In fact, you have to leave Canada within a period of 30 days and report your departure to border services officers. Now, of course, here at this moment, you have different options. One option is to comply and leave Canada. If you do that, then in theory, you can come back to Canada. In reality, you will have difficulties in getting a visa or somehow reaching Canada in the future. But anyways, you can live peacefully. The other option, of course, is to stay here without a status, because now you don't have a status, which of course, that most likely for most people means that you need to be in hiding. The other option would be filing for judicial review. Then you need to consult with a lawyer, not an immigration consultant. You need to consult with a lawyer who is an expert in this field, and then they will file a judicial review to Federal Court of Canada. If you succeed, then your application will go back to Refugee Protection Division and it will reopen. Another option is for most people, is to go in hiding for a period of 12 months. There are some exceptions for some countries, but majority of people, they need to wait at least 12 months. And then after that 12 months, you have the option to apply for either something called PRA or HNC application. Now, PRA means pre-removal risk assessment, and an application that says your life is at risk if you leave Canada. If they convince, despite that your refugee application was refused, they allow you to stay in Canada, The other option is called HNC, which is an application under humanitarian and compassionate considerations to become a permanent resident of Canada. You may apply for HNC. Of course, the reasons that you present are slightly different and shouldn't fall under Section 96 or 97 of the Act. They fall under another section of the Act, which is Section 25. And I explain HNC applications in another training video. But if your HNC applications goes through and you succeed, then you can become a permanent resident of Canada. But anyways, refusal of refugee claims means that at the end of the day, you will face lots of hurdles, and there are people that they will be in limbo for several months or several years before eventually they end up leaving Canada or somehow become permanent residents of Canada and stay in Canada. That's why if you are considering filing for refugee, make sure to consult with a truthful, trustworthy, and experienced person that they will tell you whether you qualify in the first place or not, to mitigate your risks. Even if they feel you qualify, you may get refused, but at least if you know your options, if you know the difficulties that you could face, then you will apply with open eyes, and hopefully you will succeed and become part of our society. I try to eliminate any discussions around politics and sensitive matters and just focus on the topic from a legal point of view, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Please also watch my previous videos about immigration to Canada. If you are on YouTube and watching this, I will post the subscription button here, and please also subscribe and watch my future videos. Thank you for watching this one.